Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to spend some time in the first half hour here really talking about PTSD. And you know that is a conversation we've had here before about the real need in that regard. And we're also going to talk about God's grace in the midst of difficulties, which is a theme that runs through this program so many times. And this is the new book that I wanted you to be aware of. And if you'd like to know more about it, we have a link to the website, PTSD, Passing Through Shadows of Death, and it is written by Cindy Vann, and she is the widow of a decorated Vietnam veteran, Philip Vann, and interestingly enough has pulled together just an incredible story. And Cindy, first of all, I want to thank you for writing the book, and second of all, just warn people ahead of time that you can't make your way through this book without crying. I mean, it's just one of those incredibly touching stories. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, maybe start at the beginning, because even before we get to you and your husband, you had some pretty interesting family experiences at a very early age, which, of course, influenced you in very dramatic ways, didn't they?
Yes, it did. Yes. At the age of 3, my mother passed away, and I had 3 siblings, a 9-year-old brother, 8-year-old sister, and a baby brother that had just been born. And my mother passed away 26 days after my brother was born. And my father decided, and till this day, I still don't understand why, he put us in the car and took us to an orphanage.
Yes.
And dropped us all off. And, you know, being that young, didn't understand the full magnitude of it. But as I got older and then had children of my own, I just couldn't understand how someone could do something like that, but had also no idea the impact it had on me. You know, it was something that was in my past, but yet it was deep down inside of me, a hurt.
Yes. And that was when you were 3, and you said you don't remember much, but your older siblings do remember some of that. But it kind of set a stage for all sorts of other difficulties that you ran into, because this book is really a book about how God's grace worked in your life, and also just how you have been an incredible survivor in the midst of all of that as well.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I had no idea growing up, you know, none of us know what's down the road.
Sure.
But I was adopted by family, so my last name didn't have to change. I was adopted by my biological father's older brother.
Wow.
And, you know, I was grateful for them adopting me, but I didn't realize the dysfunction that I was living in until, again, I got older, and all these things just were deep down inside me. And I believe it was around the age of 35 I had a meltdown. And, you know, the gentleman that wrote my foreword of the book, which is a police officer, Officer Phil Stemke, he is the man that brought my husband to Christ in a jail cell. Him and his wife were just absolutely, they were angels. I call them angels. And they told me, you need to go get help. So I went 2 years of counseling in our church, and just, you know, everything that was in there came out.
Yes.
And I remember the day he gave me an assignment. He said, write your dad a letter, because there was bitterness between, my father had, he had
abandoned you.
Yes,
yeah,
yes. Well,
essentially.
you know, 2 fathers, my biological dad and then my adopted dad, because when I decided I was going to marry my husband, and people will find out in the book where we met and married him, my father said to me, it's him or it's us. You can't have both.
Yes.
So the counselor told me, he says, write a letter to him. So I wrote a 10-page letter, came back the following week, read it, and it was like it just lifted all the anger and bitterness, and healing began.
And again, we've done other programs on all sorts of other issues of dysfunction and codependency and those kinds of things. And like you said, when you're a young child, you just take it as it is, and you don't really think about this.
Right.
And sometimes you develop alternative behaviors to try to cope with it and all of the rest.
Yes.
And certainly your book takes us through some of those stories as well.
Right.
But I might just mention, we got the foreword by the individual that led your husband to the Lord,
Yes.
Your dedication, and each one of the chapters starts with some key verses. You know, the other day we talked, for example, with Phil Yancey about fearfully and wonderfully made, and that's the first chapter, and all sorts of other, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, Jeremiah, and other. So people are going to, even as you're taking them through some difficulties that you've dealt with, you really show how, even before you were a Christian, but certainly after you were a Christian, how the Lord was really giving you direction and guidance. True?
He was there all the time. All the time. And that's the amazing and the beautiful part of the book, is that I tell the readers, and a lot of the readers, the reviews I have on my website said that they felt like they were in the book,
Yes.
the way I wrote it. God was there all the time. Even though I wasn't in Christ, I always knew the Lord, but I didn't have a personal relationship with him. And that's what makes the difference in life. We can know Jesus, but when you have a personal relationship, when you know that he's there with you and for you and will never leave you, that makes the difference.
Talking with Cindy Vann, and the book is entitled PTSD, Passing Through Shadows of Death. And if you find yourself saying, I'd kind of like to read this book, or I'd like to read more about that, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, and click on the picture there of her, it says see more, it will take you to cindyvann.com. And so that's one that you can follow. We also have a link to her Facebook page, and that is available. So if you'd like to know more about the book, or have her come and speak and share a testimony, because as we go through this, I think you're going to say this would be just outstanding to maybe share for an outreach to military people, for a outreach to women, or those kinds of things. But let's get into the military, because that's certainly a very important part. Your husband died of Agent Orange, and that
Yes.
brings us into all the conversation about what the Veterans Administration did and didn't do, and all of the issues of PTSD. So kind of take us through that, because that really is the theme of the book, isn't it?
Yes. In 1987, my husband tried to commit suicide multiple times. It was month after month. And it was just, going to civilian hospitals and then civilian doctors saying he's a walking time bomb. And finally we got to one hospital, and the doctor said that the VA was experimenting with a new condition called PTSD. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, I don't know much about it, but he needs to be taken to a VA hospital. So we were living in New Jersey at the time, went over to the Lions VA hospital in Morristown, New Jersey, and they put him in a locked psych ward. And all they did was give him drugs.
Yeah.
He was like doing the Thorazine shuffle, didn't know me, and, they don't want to hear their problems. Well, while he was in there, I get a letter from the VA saying that he was disqualified for his benefits for service connection for PTSD because he didn't show up for a comp and pen exam. Well, he was in their ICU from a suicide attempt. So that is what many, many veterans go through. And the sad part is a lot of people don't have people like me, as my husband's wife, to go and fight for them.
Right.
They just go, the system's too big, and they don't know what to do.
They give up.
Yeah, they give up. They become hopeless. And then you have suicides, which we have suicides now from the Iraq and Afghanistan war.
We've got all these deaths of despair, which are either due to suicides or due to various kinds of overdoses. So
Yes.
Let's take a break. I want to come back and get into this in a little more detail, because that really is the theme of the book. And I think it would be a real comfort and a help to some of you maybe listening right now that are struggling with this, or somebody that is,
Right.
and you may want to pass this book on, or maybe even schedule Cindy to come and speak on that issue. A lot more to cover. We will do so. The book is entitled PTSD, Passing Through Shadows of Death. We'll have more to talk about right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In light of the publicized mass shootings, pundits and politicians are calling for action. Certainly, there are some policies that should be considered. However, these policies need to be informed by accurate numbers and statistics. Unfortunately, most Americans believe many things about gun violence that aren't true. One article that appeared in the Washington Post earlier this year warned that most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. Also, suburban and small-town women have the least accurate views about the murder rate. Some believe this demographic group will be swing voters in the 2020 election. In case you're wondering, the murder rate between 1995 and 2017 dropped by almost half. It is easy to understand why people might not know this, since every time there's a shooting, we are subjected to wall-to-wall coverage. Of course, that is not always true in some cases. In the days leading up to the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, there were 60 shootings in Chicago. There were so many, in fact, that one hospital had to stop accepting patients on Sunday because the trauma center was maxed out. Gun violence isn't uniform. Most firearm murders are concentrated in a few areas. Over half of all murders occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and a high percentage of those murders are linked to gang or drug activity. Also, a high percentage of gun deaths are due to suicides. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention each year publish data on gun deaths. In any particular year you pick, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes by as much as 2 to 1. There will be a major push this year to change current policies in an effort to stem gun violence. As we're debating these issues, it is crucial that pundits, politicians, and even voters have an accurate understanding of the statistics associated with gun violence. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films and the Kendrick Brothers, Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shire, rated PG, in theaters this Friday. Overcomermovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Cindy Vann in studio for a few more minutes as we talk about her book, PTSD. And let me just encourage you to go to the website because, first of all, you can get a copy of the book. Second of all, I really hope that you'll think about having her come and speak maybe to your veterans group. You know, we have 22 individuals each day that commit suicide. We have these deaths of despair where individuals either are committing suicide or drug overdoses, or if they survive, they're pushing shopping carts full of their belongings, or they're homeless out on the streets. And so we certainly have a great deal of compassion for them. But speak to the compassion that we should have for the wives, because as your husband, Philip, is just crazy and not in his right mind, he's not treating you very nicely either, is he?
No, he wasn't. And again, he wasn't in his right mind. He was doing drugs. I mean, he drank a quart of vodka every day. And,
wow.
Yeah. And he did heroin. He did cocaine. I used to say he was a tank because it seemed nothing knocked him down. But later on, at the age of 55, that's when, you know, his body was breaking down and it was downhill from there.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as women, and, you know, PTSD is just not exclusive for veterans.
No.
I mean, it's a huge thing. I mean, you lose a child. There's people that go through it. I mean, our EMS people, firemen, police officers, you know, it's trauma when you see trauma. So for a woman that is married to a veteran or a significant other, it's hard to hang in there and stay in there. What I suggest you do is prayer is very important, and faith. If you don't have that, you need to go seek it because you can't do it on your own. You can go to secular counseling. My husband did that at the VA hospital, and it did nothing. It was a revolving door. He'd go in and he'd leave. One of his doctors would say to me, we know that he comes here to the meeting, the PTSD meeting, but then he goes right to the bar.
Yeah.
You can't do it without Christ.
Yes.
Christ is the answer. And so for a woman that might be with a man, or even parents that have a son or a daughter that comes back from war, you need, first of all, to let them know they're loved. No matter what they do, where they go, they're loved. And seek help. And my suggestion is get into a Christian Bible-based church where they have counseling. Because that's what saved my husband. That police officer that arrested him got him to a church, and that's where our life changed.
Let's talk about that for just a minute, because this is a book that I think you could hand to anybody that's struggling with PTSD. It'd also be a book, even if you aren't to help you understand that the answer to many of the problems you're dealing with are certainly Jesus Christ. And that is really, again, the theme of the book. And talk about that, because a lot of people say, well, that's just a fix, that's just, a crutch. But you really saw a remarkable transformation of him after he became a Christian, didn't you?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying secular counseling doesn't work. I'm not here to put that down. But I do know what worked for us. As soon as he was arrested and this police officer, Phil Stemke, came into his life, and I believe that was God too.
Yes.
I mean, any police officer could have came to my home that day and took that police report, but he was sent. And, he didn't even know at the time what he was in for. But when he went home that night, he told his wife, he said, I met the littlest woman with 3 little children that has the biggest problems I've ever seen as an officer. And he said, we need to help them, because that was the Christianity in him.
Right.
He went outside of that badge and helped my husband. And he asked my husband if he knew Christ. And my husband grew up in a home where he did know Christ, but he walked away after war.
Yes.
And he said, can I pray with you? So he called he was a door gunner, another friend. And he said, he was a hairdresser. He said, could you come to the jail and pray with me? He says, we've got a brother here. And the 3 of them prayed. They knelt down and prayed. And my husband said that there was such a white light that was so bright, because he tried to keep opening his eyes to look, and he couldn't even open his eyes. And they knew at that moment that Christ had. He never went through withdrawal, anything.
Isn't that amazing?
It's just absolutely amazing.
Yes.
And he was a new man as of that moment. And, he went to court, and we thought he was going to be facing jail time because the person that charged him lied. And all these police officers from that police station came to that courtroom that day, went up to the Your Honor and asked if she would be lenient on him because of, and she gave him 6 months in the workhouse. He went in October, and on Christmas Eve, the judge ordered to let him go. And again, it was God.
And
it was God all the time. It was overwhelming at sometimes how God just kept moving, and and like you said, when people read it, they're going to cry.
Oh, sure. 5 years ago he died, and just before we talk about that, there's another theme that runs through that, and that is the impact that the church had in your life. I'm a deacon, so I can appreciate the deacon visits and things of that nature. And as Agent Orange and other things were taking over his body, this is another place for the body of Christ to reach out, and to reach out to not only him, but to you in the midst of some of that grief and some of the uncertainty about the future, isn't there?
Absolutely. Well, I've been a member of Prestonwood since 2006 and baptized there, and my husband as well. But my son was going to a different church. So I was going back and forth, got to know people there. And the body of Christ is, it's just amazing. A church is a building, but, we are vessels for Christ. And all these people rallied around us, came and prayed with us. The deacons from Prestonwood Church would line up on the outside walls of my husband's hospital room and came every single day. Our Bible study, they came and brought gifts. When we came home for just a matter of weeks, they brought food. That's what people that love the Lord do. And people that don't have the Lord don't understand that.
Yes. Well, if nothing else, I want to thank Hunter and Judy, who are in my Sunday school class, who first told me about your book. And I imagine they'll be listening to this when they're able to do so. But just before we let you go, Cindy, let's talk about how people can use this. Because first of all, I've already given people some suggestions about handing this book, buying a copy and handing it to somebody they know is struggling. And it could be they're struggling with PTSD or just some of the difficulties that all of us face in life. So that's one great application. But again, we have a place where people can contact you. And I think you would just be great to come and speak to veterans groups when they do a military celebration, especially Memorial Day, Veterans Day, those kinds of things. Or you're certainly available to speak to women's groups as well, just to be an encouragement to them. So talk about how people can use what is on your website in a way that can contact you or find out more about some of the resources that you have.
Well, thank you. My website has everything available about the book. My Facebook as well. I'm on Instagram. My Facebook still has my husband's name on it. He lives within my heart forever. We were married 34 years. It would have been 39 years this year, but I know where he's at. And, you know, if someone wants to call on me, even if it's a personal matter, personal, you know, big events, I'm there. I'm available all the time. And, you know, that is my gift to give back for what God did for me. And I hope that people will understand that, you know, when we go beyond ourselves, that's when we know, you know, that Christ dwells within us. And it's to go out. That's my ministry, is to go help others.
And again, some great resources there. There's a home section there. There's the shop. And if you go there, you can, of course, get the hard copy. And I'll hold this up again for people that have not seen the book. Or you can also get a download in case you wanted to maybe send it to somebody digitally. And, of course, there's a Kindle edition. There's an events section, and that would be something I'd like you to consider, because I know you've done some book signings and things like that. That would be another opportunity where you could speak to women and then sign the book afterwards. And then there's also other material on how to find help with PTSD. So if that's something you're specifically dealing with, you've got a number of videos and other resources. So talk about that, because some of our listeners might now say, oh, I didn't know there was help. Where could I find some of that?
Absolutely. And there's help in Prestonwood for One Church. They have a beautiful ministry that Michael Perrin is in charge of.
Yes.
And I highly suggest, I know Michael Perrin, and he's a fantastic man, a man of God. He's been through, you know, horrendous things himself. And because of what he's been through and in Christ, he knows how to relate to these things. So I highly suggest Prestonwood, the Michael Perrin ministry that they have there.
Sure. And again, if you want to know a little bit more, we have a link to her website. We have a Facebook page. You can also from there find the Instagram material. You can get the book in hardcover or Kindle, and it just is something that I think is a real felt need. Maybe next time we do some kind of roundtable on PTSD, maybe we'll have you come back again, since you had a chance to educate people. But again, if you're just joining us, talking about this book, PTSD, Passing Through Shadows of Death. And Cindy, thank you so very much for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to take a break. We have a lot to cover in the news. I might mention Lydia Ortega is going to be with us in studio in about a half an hour, but I've got a few things to talk about, and that will happen right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that in about a half an hour, we're going to have Lydia Ortega in studio, individual that has been a professor at San Jose State University and lived in California for many years, and as an economics professor who now is here in the Dallas area. And I think you're going to appreciate this for two reasons. Number one, she has left California, come to Texas. Number two is I think the treasurer right now for the Hispanic Republican Club of North Texas, but more importantly, has been writing about the fact that don't turn Texas into California. There are some lessons that California can teach us vicariously that we need to apply. So I think you'll appreciate that conversation, which will be taking place at 1 o'clock. Since we were talking about PTSD, I thought we would talk about the war on terror for just a minute, because our lead article is something that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but this one was the most horrific, and that is in Afghanistan. There is a wonderful wedding taking place, and there are people dancing. There are children and adults at this wedding clapping and everything, and all of a sudden an explosion. A suicide bomber in the midst of all that killed all sorts of individuals. The article that we've posted here talked about 63 killed, 182 wounded in the capital of Afghanistan. I suspect that body count, sadly, probably has gone up since then. And so this is a reminder again of what is happening on the other part of the globe, and one of the reasons why we have always tried to have some kind of military presence in Afghanistan. Now, there are two ways to look at this. One way to look at this is the way in which some have said, well, this is just going to happen anyway, and it's just a sad commentary on the fact that we have all sorts of different terrorist organizations, and this one, ISIS, took credit for it. And ISIS really began to grow when there was a decision by the previous president to pull troops out of places like Iraq. And so here again, we are reminded of the fact that there are evil doers in the world, especially those coming from a Muslim point of view, that are dangerous. And so on the one hand, you have some saying, well, it's just sad that we can't do anything about this. We are not called to be the world's policeman. And I suspect that in a couple of weeks, when we have the Democratic debates, we're going to hear a lot of individuals saying, as sad as all this is, we need to pull out. There's the other perspective, and it's the perspective that was certainly held by George W. Bush, and yet has been much more ambivalent under Barack Obama, much more ambivalent under Donald Trump, that says, well, we just simply can't do much about this. And so if we go back to those who say, if we don't at least have a presence here, ISIS could grow again, and instead of just blowing up people in a wedding in Kabul, Afghanistan, they could be blowing up people in downtown New York, or they could get their hands on nuclear weapon and take out a good portion of the United States. So this is just a harsh reminder of the fact that even though we live over here and our biggest complaints are taxes, our biggest complaints are rudeness, our biggest complaints are the fact that we don't have health care provided for every single citizen because some people either can't afford it or they don't want it. But there are people in the world that aren't sure they're going to live tomorrow because of these kinds of actions. And so you have now over in Afghanistan stunned families burying the dead, some actually digging with their bare hands. One of the wounded survivors it talks about here still wore his bloody clothes the day after the blast. You have those that are waiting to bury more. And again, just the emergence once again of ISIS, or the Islamic State. And it's still one of the greatest threats to the Afghan citizens, as the United States and the Taliban right now are trying to seek some kind of agreement to end 18 years of fighting over there. Of course, the United States wants assurance from the Taliban that Afghanistan will no longer be a launch pad for global terrorist attacks. And yet this article that I have posted for you to read is a reminder that even as we are trying to get those assurances, we have pretty good evidence that ISIS or the Islamic State, depending on how you want to refer to it, is still alive and well and killing people in record numbers. So just wanted to put that on the table. We may come back to that a little bit later in the third hour, but I thought I'd mention it real quickly, especially since we were talking about this issue of PTSD. Let me jump to a different issue, and it's one that surfaced a little bit on Friday, but it's worth coming back to. Sometimes you have the question, well, okay, we win a Supreme Court decision. Does it have any impact? And the answer is yes. And this one is actually one that was posted by the Wall Street Journal. The secular busybodies lose again. And the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal put it this way. They said the Supreme Court precedent travels fast. Less than 2 months after the justices ruled that a 40-foot stone war memorial, the Peace Cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, which we've talked about so many times, could stay standing on public ground despite its religious symbolism, now a federal appeals court has applied that logic to save a 75-year-old county seal. In Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, that actually includes Allentown, it adopted a seal that actually has a number of symbols that illustrate what has been happening over these many, if you will, centuries in Pennsylvania. And one of those symbols, as you might imagine, is a cross. Well, as you can imagine, our friends with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as they refer to it, a busybody outfit that wants to expunge religious symbols from public life, actually brought suit. And Lehigh County refused to discontinue this seal, saying that it honored the area's history. And there's a lot of things. It shows factories, it shows people working, it shows flags, it shows a heart, it shows the kind of the city hall, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, it has a cross. So it isn't like it's the only thing on the seal. There are all sorts of things on the seal. And so they brought suit back in 2016. But again, sometimes people say, okay, we won at the Supreme Court. What's the impact? The impact is that it now sends the word down to all sorts of other appeals courts. And just the other day, of course, you had the federal district court refused to rule a seal as the first as a violation of the First Amendment based on the Establishment Clause. And so now you, of course, have the ruling that has come down from the Supreme Court. And so it illustrates again that, first of all, you had difficulty for a federal judge ruling that it was unconstitutional. But now you have a ruling from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which actually said the Lemon Test, which we've talked about on this program before, is dead regarding monuments, symbols, mottos, displays, and ceremonies. And every once in a while I have somebody say, can you explain the Lemon Test? I'll do it one more time if I can. The Lemon Test, interestingly enough, was a ruling back in 1971. It was called Lemon versus Kurtzman, so that's where the Lemon Test came up. But it set up kind of a three-part test to determine whether something was constitutional or unconstitutional based upon the First Amendment. It was nothing based upon the Constitution. As a matter of fact, if you want to read a little bit more about it, let me give you a short little commercial. My little booklet here on constitutional interpretation would be a good way to kind of explain some of this very easily. But again, it said that there should be no excessive entanglement, that there should be a secular purpose and all the rest. And even using the Lemon Test, you could say, well, the seal has a secular purpose. It's to show that that's the seal of Lehigh, Pennsylvania. There's no excessive entanglement. It's only got a cross in the midst of all sorts of other images. So even using the Lemon Test, it would be difficult to say that this Lehigh County seal would be an unconstitutional establishment of religion. But what has happened with this latest Supreme Court test is to say the Lemon Test was never a good test. It's time to squeeze out the Lemon Test and to forget and forgive all the attempts to come up with these bizarre tests, which are not constitutional tests in the first place. And thus the seal of the county of Lehigh, Pennsylvania, is not unconstitutional, and it will stand. Now, the good news is that now that's a ruling on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. There's been some others in places like the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And as this works its way out, what you're going to see is there are going to be fewer and fewer of these cases, I suspect, that will go to the courts, because even though the Freedom from Religion Foundation and Americans United for Separation of Church and State, maybe even the ACLU, will try to occasionally bring those cases, you can see judges now say, no, we've already ruled on that, and dismiss the case, and that will be the end of that. So it's going to make the work of Alliance Defending Freedom and the Center for various religious liberty issues, including the First Liberty Institute, it's going to make their job a whole lot easier. Let's take a break. Got a lot more to cover, and I will do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that in about 15 minutes, we're going to have Professor Lydia Ortega here. She's a free market economist, used to be in California, now is in North Texas. Thought this would be very helpful because of her comments that she's a California refugee, warns Texans don't make the same mistakes. And so I think we can learn some lessons, and certainly that is what we will be talking about with her in the next segment. But in this one, I thought just real quickly, I didn't post this, although maybe later we should, by our friend Robert Knight, who's on the program with us so many times, because he does a twofer here. It's called Of Cows and Men. Instead of Of Mice and Men, it's Of Cows 1,000 men. And the reason for that is there have been two things that have been happening simultaneously here. First of all, dairy cows have been considered contributors to the problem of climate change. Second of all, this one is, I can't say with a straight face, but there are people that are actually arguing that the dairy industry is a host for sex-based discrimination. You can't make this stuff up. So I'll just let Robert Knight explain it because I saw this the other day, and it really was pretty amazing to me. He says, are dairy cows dangerous contributors to climate change or victims of toxic masculinity? Perhaps they're both if you accept the hysteria over cow-emitted methane, along with the sexual politics of feminists at a taxpayer-funded university. It's well known that the Green New Deal promoted by Democratic Party leader Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a New York Democrat, calls for eliminating cows. But did you know that milking cows constitutes sexual abuse? When I first read this, I was sure this was the Babylon Bee or the Onion, but I'm not making this up, and I'll just let, again, Robert Knight take us through this conversation. It does, according to a paper published by the Women and Gender Studies program at a state university there in New York. The title of it was Ready for Rape Rack, Feminism and the Exploitation of Non-Human Reproductive Systems. The paper argues that the dairy industry is a host for sex-based discrimination and a site where sexual assault and objectification based on biological makeup are highly prevalent, but ignored as we choose to neglect non-humans with whom we share the planet. First of all, you have to be kind of a planet activist, an environmental activist. You have to also be part of the animal rights activists. But nevertheless, the paper actually compares inseminating cattle to rape and milking the cows as sexual abuse. She asks humans to consider the importance of animals' lives as equal to your own, and then goes into full Marxist mode, encouraging activists to treat cows similar to how you might validate and advocate for the struggles of women you personally do not endure to the privilege of race, gender, class. So stack human privilege right up there with right privilege as well. Well, he says, I've taken to heart, but must confess my wife recently brought back a half gallon of unpasteurized raw milk from Pennsylvania. It is utterly delicious. I knew he was going to throw one of those in there as well. And so the point he's making is that we're starting to lose perspective on some of this. And one of my commentaries that came out and will be out later this week gets into some of the most bizarre kinds of commentaries that we're seeing. And if nothing else, I think what he is talking about is the need for us to also recognize that while we may roll our eyes about some of the things being said about cattle, we also have to recognize that we have a number of individuals that simply believe that the answer to all of our problems is going to be socialism and a socialist experiment. And so, not that I support, he says, commerce with the Castro brothers' communist regime, even surreptitiously. The sooner that cloud is dispensed, the sooner their grip on our own country and miserable places like Venezuela will be loosened and people freed, regardless of Bernie Sanders' wishes, he says. And he says, speaking of freedom, it would be nice to find some common ground so that Americans stop talking past each other. But he said this probably won't happen soon. The division is far deeper than mere politics. It's all about worldview, and deeper still, how each side regards Americans' heritage and God. It's about the clash of two religions, one Bible-based and the other careening towards a revived paganism masquerading as agnosticism. In his perceptive new book, The Last Call for Liberty, by Os Guinness, who was in studio with us a while back to talk about that. Os Guinness argues that today's cultural and political struggles reflect the great differences between the revolutions in 1776 and 1789. Of course, 1776 is the American Revolution. 1789 would be the French Revolution, which was a revolt against royalty, but also against any authority higher than whatever the people concocted. It soon devolved into a bloodbath and a dictatorship. Its heirs, he says, are Marxism and all forms of socialism, including National Socialism, fascism, and communism. By contrast, Robert Knight says, British colonists in America in 1776 took a covenantal approach, grounding their new nation in rights given not by man, but by God. And Os Guinness in his book says, to be sure, the American experiment was never a covenant with God as the Jewish covenant of Mount Sinai was, but it is no longer what it has long been, a covenant or a constitution under God. And Robert Knight goes on to say that with Marxists and other anti-God secularists firmly in control of major institutions that transmit cultural values, even many churches, he says, the American experiment has increasingly become a constitution without God. The effects are all around us, Robert Knight says, from the ever-growing government coercion to young people fooled by socialism, as we've talked about before on this program, to crazed gunmen, to drag queen story hour, even to the insanity of the Cow Manifesto you mentioned just a few minutes ago. And he says, without roots in the biblical understanding of human nature, America has become a cut flower culture that can no longer survive unless there is a recovery of values that nourish the birth of our self-governing republic. And those are some comments that you find in the book by Os Guinness, The Last Call to Liberty. Finally, as a self-described resident alien from Great Britain, America has become, Os Guinness says, America has become, as he said, that cut flower culture, and as a result is one that, if nothing else, needs to have a perspective that we get from a person like Os Guinness, just as Alexander de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who actually provided a very perceptive critique back in the 1830s. And Os Guinness also says that at the heart of American liberty is the understanding that no freedom is possible without God, because it is the biblical view that is fully realistic about the crooked timber of humanity that provides the ultimate check and balance on human power, the abuse of power, and utopianism. And we are created in the image of God as morally discerning beings, but we're flawed and so must keep everyone and anyone from getting too much power. Os Guinness talks about that, and the framers understood it. One last quote from Os Guinness that Robert Knight brings. Os Guinness says, progressive secular elites have grown accountable to no one. They have thrown off restraint for themselves and respect for others. They have decided that they are the rulers and all others are the ruled. They have rejected the role of faith in public life today and are now intent on stifling the free exercise of faith wherever they can. So if nothing else, just a nice piece by Robert Knight, which starts out talking about cows and methane and also cows and sexual abuse, and we're not making that up, but then quickly goes into a very good book that we have talked about before with Os Guinness, The Last Call to Liberty, How America's Genius for Freedom has become its greatest threat. And so we may get Os Guinness back on again to talk about that. But after the break, Dr. Lydia Ortega is going to be with us. She's been a professor of economics and an individual that used to live in California, now lives in Texas, and warns us not to apply some of the things that are happening in California to the rest of the states of the nation. We'll talk with her right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We've got a very busy week of all sorts of interviews, and the one we have in studio right now is one that I know will be of interest to you. Individual that has actually been a professor in California, moved to the state of Texas, and has told a lot of Texans, don't California what is happening in the state of Texas. Now, of course, I know many of you listening from other states as well, but I wanted you to learn some lessons from an individual that actually has a perspective that you need to hear in terms of politics and economics. Professor Lydia Ortega is in studio with us today. She had her doctorate in economics from George Mason University. Individual that for 15 years was the chair of the Department of Economics at San Jose State University, and also was very much involved in a variety of other activities, the founding member of the Hispanic Foundation of Silicon Valley, Liberty Forum in Silicon Valley, and even ran for the lieutenant governor of the state of California as a lieutenant governor campaign, but now is in the state of Texas, is a treasurer with the Hispanic Republican Club of Northern Texas, and Lydia, just great to have you in studio.
Thank you, Kerby. I'm so happy to be here.
You know, I was reading this article the other day about you, which has generated a lot of stir because it says you're a California refugee. You know, I was born in California, so I can relate to some of what you're talking about here. But after coming to Texas, you recognize that people in this state tend to have more self-reliance. They tend to be talking about individual values. And having lived in California for many years, where it's intersectionality, it's identity politics, it is government is the answer to all solutions and all problems, it does seem to me that you've seen a remarkable difference between these two states you've lived in.
It's been night and day. And I've talked with people, young women, and I asked them, how would you distinguish, how would you characterize Texas? What are distinguishing characteristics? And they said, well, we say y'all a lot, and sweet tea is important. And I thought, yeah, that's where their attention is. But more importantly, what I found is that you say, can I help you, ma'am?
Yes.
A lot. Mm-hmm. And I looked into this and I've studied it. You are ready, willing, and able and prepared to help people. It happens all the time. And when I mentioned that to them, to the young girls, they said, yeah, we do that. I said, well, don't take it for granted, because it takes a conscious effort to be prepared to help somebody. It takes attention on a situation. Does this person need help? So I had come to Texas, and I'm trying to struggle to put a ladder in my car. Some man is walking down the aisle, and he just says, can I help you, ma'am? Grabs the ladder, twists it in, and he's off back into Costco before I can even say, who was that masked man? I go back home, and I'm buying boxes at Home Depot. It's raining. It's drizzling. I have all these flat boxes. They're not heavy, but they're awkward, and the wind's blowing, and one flies off in the parking lot. There's people all around me. They're looking at their cell phones. They're not situationally aware that I need help. And it was an awkward way for me to pick up that one and hold the other ones into the basket. No one helped me. And I think it's in part because they don't trust that the help will be received. Here in Texas, if you help someone, it's welcomed. You know, there's that trust that this is what we do. And if you don't know it, if you don't treasure it, That's how you lose it.
Yeah.
We lost that in California.
Well, let's see if we can talk about some of the economic issues, because you've looked at this. And one of the things that I wrote about a number of months ago is how easy it is to actually build a fast food restaurant or even build a gas station in the state of Texas compared to California. And since I have lived in both states, it's dramatically different. And a lot of it has to do with those regulations that you don't really think about until you're an entrepreneur trying to establish a business. Isn't that something that you found?
It is incredibly difficult. My husband and I tried to start our, little business, and I have a PhD. I should be able to fill out all these forms. I should be able to figure out how it goes along. And it took so much time. It wasn't worth it to have the business. That's incredible, where the amount of energy and time went not into growing the business, employing people. It went into complying with regulations. And I believe that our economy is growing to a large extent because of this cut in deregulations, because firms large and small predict future deregulation cuts. The handcuffs are off, and individuals can follow their dreams now.
Talking with Dr. Lydia Ortega, and I want to get into the Hispanic issue for just a minute, but let's talk about those regulations one more minute at least, and that is we have some of the possible Democratic candidates. A lot of people think that the person that might challenge Donald Trump either could be Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts or Kamala Harris from California. Both of them believe we need a lot more regulations. We need a lot more bureaucracy. We need a Green New Deal. We need a Medicare for all. But you're an economist and looked at the free market. What would be the impact if we were to turn some of that around? Because right now, the current president has wanted to have a great deal of deregulation.
The market depends on individual sovereignty, period. It depends on people recognizing what they're good at, what they want to do, what their dreams are, what their passions are, and then going out and finding a way to please enough customers that they'll come back. And that's what the market thrives on. And this market system has done more to eliminate poverty around the world than any other system. The socialist system doesn't depend on people being nice to each other. It depends on identifying threats and producing victims. It depends on taking away your individual power. I couldn't play that game. I couldn't make my students victims because I didn't want to take away their source of power, their individual identity. And that's what socialism asks you to do. Just be a victim so that somebody else can solve your problems and therefore have control over you.
Well, and again, if you don't have victims, you don't have big government, because if you say, no, you're responsible for your health care, you're responsible for starting your own business, we'll provide a safety net or something of that nature. But if indeed you are trying to run against an economy right now, which of course has had a couple ups and downs because of the stock market, but if indeed you are running against a candidate who could point to the fact that you have the lowest unemployment for African Americans, really in history, the lowest unemployment for Hispanic Americans, the lowest unemployment for almost 50 years for women, you got to make someone a victim. And so you've got to say, well, no, you need government to solve your problems, when a lot of people are saying, I kind of like my paycheck. And you got to run against corporations. And some of those people work with Walmart and say, I kind of like the Walmart in my neighborhood because I've got a lot of selection and it's low prices. And Amazon, well, yeah, and I may think that they should pay some taxes, but after all, I get a lot of things from Amazon. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that, because the message that we're getting right now is actually, at least from the Democratic debates, is this is a really horrible country and people are victims. And if anything, there is just a need for more government intervention. So I want to hear from an economist about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In light of the publicized mass shootings, pundits and politicians are calling for action. Certainly, there are some policies that should be considered. However, these policies need to be informed by accurate numbers and statistics. Unfortunately, most Americans believe many things about gun violence that aren't true. One article that appeared in the Washington Post earlier this year warned that most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. Also, suburban and small-town women have the least accurate views about the murder rate. Some believe this demographic group will be swing voters in the 2020 election. In case you're wondering, the murder rate between 1995 and 2017 dropped by almost half. It is easy to understand why people might not know this, since every time there's a shooting, we are subjected to wall-to-wall coverage. Of course, that is not always true in some cases. In the days leading up to the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, there were 60 shootings in Chicago. There were so many, in fact, that one hospital had to stop accepting patients on Sunday because the trauma center was maxed out. Gun violence isn't uniform. Most firearm murders are concentrated in a few areas. Over half of all murders occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and a high percentage of those murders are linked to gang or drug activity. Also, a high percentage of gun deaths are due to suicides. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention each year publish data on gun deaths. In any particular year you pick, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes by as much as 2 to 1. There will be a major push this year to change current policies in an effort to stem gun violence. As we're debating these issues, it is crucial that pundits, politicians, and even voters have an accurate understanding of the statistics associated with gun violence. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films and the Kendrick Brothers, Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shire, rated PG, in theaters this Friday. Overcomermovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have in studio with us today Dr. Lydia Ortega, and an individual that for 15 years was the chair of the Department of Economics in San Jose State, one of the few free market economies, economic departments, I guess would be a better way to say it, there in the state of California or even on the West Coast, and now in the state of Texas. And just a minute ago, I talked about this fact that if indeed you want big government, you have to make people victims. If indeed you're convinced that we need more government, you have to say, well, really the economy isn't as good as you think it is, and corporations are the problem. But I think there are a fair number of Americans that are saying, you know, I feel pretty good about the fact that my median family income is increasing, the unemployment rate's pretty low, and so this is why we're hearing everybody kind of running down America. What are your thoughts as an economist?
I really trust the common sense of people. So they can hear what the pundits are saying, they can hear what the candidates are saying, but they know what it's like at the DMV. Okay. They know what it's like at the, VA hospital. They see where government can't do the basic services. So, why rely on that kind of system? So I think that if we just pull back and say, what do I know as a fact? Did we have high unemployment? Don't look at the numbers. Look at how many open or lease signs are in a strip mall. And as you start seeing those places fill up and you start seeing the, for lease signs replaced by help wanted signs, that's your unemployment indicator right there. And we see the lowest unemployment rates for Hispanics. And it's a remarkable event, this entrepreneurial culture, this group that really appreciates family and helps one another to go forward. My family sacrificed for me to get my doctorate. And they say, it's our doctorate, Lydia. And they're right. I share it with them because they're part of who I am. They're my identity. So, when we talk about helping people, it's just to make a ribbon cutting ceremony, to make some kind of bill. I see more government directed at climate help that actually hurts poorest people the most. And that infuriates me. All the taxes, all the lane changes to reduce the amount of drivers in Southern California for the sake of a global climate, it's hurting those people who are trying to run a business, who have to commute on those highways. And it's getting more and more congested. The gas prices are going up and up and up. And they don't have a Lexus. They didn't get it. They don't have an electric car. They're using, gasoline, and the price is sky high for them. So don't help. If you want to change the climate, make the rich people pay it, not the poorest people.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about your Hispanic background, because you ran for lieutenant governor, and I think anybody that did not know you, Lydia Ortega, professor, San Jose State, running for lieutenant governor, who's Hispanic, obviously must be a progressive, and you must have had more people saying, what? You actually believe in a free market? You actually believe in conservatism, and you're Hispanic? How did you respond to that?
Well, they did that all my career. I think that my colleagues for the longest time, not in the Department of Economics, but the university at large, they must have heard what I said, but it went through filters. So it came out, she must mean this.
Yes.
So it's happened all my life. It's a classic prejudgment based on external features and not an intention to understand who I am as an individual.
Right.
The interview that I had that was most interesting was a woman who said, what are other Latinas going to say about this? What can you say to them? I told them, I don't know. They're so different. We are individuals with different experiences. So, my mother, my father, they get all the credit for making me a Latina. Okay. I just want credit for running a great department, for getting a PhD. When I stand before my God, he's going to say, what did you do with what you were given? And evaluate what I'd done, not how I was born.
When you ran for lieutenant governor in the state of California, you probably knew you weren't going to win. And it's not the same California when my father ran for California Assembly or when we had Ronald Reagan as the governor. But it does seem to me that it's still possible that you or anybody that has your kind of philosophy could still win in many of the other states where we broadcast. And so the question, I guess, comes back to is if there has been this kind of desire to take the ideas in New York and California and spread them to the rest of the country, then you aren't going to have these kind of ideas being given a fair appreciation and even a fair hearing in the universities or even in the public arena, right?
It's right. I'm here and I'm more authentically me here. I can be conservative. I can be Christian. I can be female. I can be anything I want here. I have the right to speak my piece here. And that's something else that you Texans may be taking for granted, that you get to say, I disagree. And that's gone in California. People are just becoming quiet because you don't know what's going to offend anybody. But my political path here came out of the running for lieutenant governor because I learned about the grassroots effort. I never knew it existed. And now I'm walking precincts and I'm, knocking on doors and calling people because I'm atoning. I'm atoning for not putting up my time to do my civic duty. I didn't serve, not on a commission, not on a board, not on anything. And if I didn't put the time to do it, then somebody else did, and that somebody else didn't have the same values, didn't have a challenge from my set of values. So I'm here to atone. I'm here to make sure that we don't neglect these treasures you have. I'm not going to move again. I want them to stay here.
And I want to get you around the round table for some of the conversation we'll have in the future. But I just thought for a minute I might just let people know that you would be available to come and speak to various civic groups and certainly address this issue of economics. And the other issue I was thinking about is we have a number of our listeners that would love to have their young people go off to a university, but actually instead of learning about socialism, they would like to learn about capitalism. And you were fortunate enough to have a department that for at least a while had that. And certainly we can see that at George Mason, maybe at Hillsdale, Grove City College, and a few others. But there aren't too many places where you can go and study economics and get a free market perspective. Is that fair?
That's extremely accurate. Walter Williams used to call our department GMU on the left coast. But when we were focused, our faculty was not on doing what the socialists were doing, which was indoctrinating.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Our goal was to open minds, to get them to question again. And that's what gets shut down around fourth grade. People have to do a multiple choice test. They stop questioning.
Wow.
And that goes all the way through college. If you tell them as a lecturer, the sun is pink and the sky is black, they'll just take notes and write it down and expect that to be the answer in a multiple choice test. So you have to reawaken that questioning mind, and it can be done outside of an academic institution. It can be done with homeschooling. That's why homeschoolers are so good. And it can be done with just looking at your children and saying, that's a good question. Let's go and look into it. Just keep rewarding and giving them lots of feedback on that. It's the most critical skill that was stopped early on.
Yes.
The questioning mind.
One of the things I wanted to do is we did post this article entitled California Refugee Warns Texans Don't Make the Same Mistakes. But, of course, it's not just Texans. It's all sorts of listeners across the country. And, of course, we have Californians that are saying, yeah, I wish we could turn this state around. But there are some really important issues coming up in this campaign, but also in the popular culture. And if you were wanting to know a little bit more about Lydia Ortega, we have a link there as well. And you're available to go and speak and to address some of these issues and some of these economic free market principles, and to have an individual that addresses that with a doctorate from economics, worked with Walter Williams there, George Mason and others. I just wanted you to know about her, and I'm hoping that maybe you can join us for one of our roundtable discussions on one of these important issues in the future.
I'll be happy to be back.
And I know I'm going to be seeing you tonight at an event, so I'm looking forward to that as well. But I just wanted you to know a little bit more about Professor Lydia Ortega, an individual that for many years was the chair of the Department of Economics at San Jose State University for 15 years, and now more recently is involved in the state of Texas. And so it is great to have you in studio. So thank you for joining us. I might just mention that when we come back from the break, we're going to get into a couple other aspects of California. One of those is Google. My commentary last Friday was on Google censorship. We now have two Google insiders coming up talking about the bias against conservatives. So we'll talk about that. And I might just mention that oftentimes we spend a fair amount of time talking about books published by Regnery Publishing. Well, in the next hour, Alfred Regnery will be with us as we'll be talking about his book. So there'll be a great opportunity for you to learn a little bit more. But if you would like to know more about some of the things we're talking about today, many of the articles are posted on our website, pointofview.net. Click on those and you'll find some great material. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the booklets we have is on social media, and the focus there is on the influence of social media in your life. But then I have a section on social media censorship. And this is a topic that we keep coming back to time and time again. We covered this a number of months ago in our Outlook magazine. My Friday commentary was entitled Google Censorship, in which I was, if nothing else, quoting from a piece by Dennis Prager, which was entitled Don't Let Google Get Away with Censorship. And he was really pointing out at the time that there were 56 of his videos that have been put on a restricted list by YouTube, owned by Google, of course. And since then, the number's gone up, by the way, because I've seen some others. And he said, you know, he'd never really been able to get Google or YouTube to really give an answer to why those were put on a restricted list, except in a Senate hearing of all places. One of those individuals said that the Ten Commandments video was restricted, according to the Google representative, because the video referred to murder. I'm not joking, but apparently he was joking when then he offered to release a Google-friendly video on the 9 commandments, leaving out the commandment of thou shalt not murder. And so the point I'm making there is that there are some benefits that various high-tech and big tech companies have from the 1996 Communications Decency Act. But the argument that is oftentimes made by these individuals with a straight face is we're not censoring at all. And I quoted even last week an article that appeared in the Columbia Journalism Review just saying this is just nothing more than a conspiracy theory. So in order to try to give you the other side that just simply is not getting much of a hearing in the mainstream media, I've posted this particular article by Rachel Alexander. Now, she's been on the program with us before. Maybe I'll have her on again, but I'll try to do this one simply without her because she talks about these two different engineers at Google, Greg Coppola and Zachary Voorhees. I believe I'm pronouncing their names correctly. That are insiders that have given information about this to Project Veritas. And so, again, this is where you're starting to see some of these people coming forward. So for just a few minutes, let me kind of briefly summarize this entire article, which you can read and check out for yourself, because we're going to talk about, first of all, how some of the algorithms are done in a way to not be fair to groups. Then there's actually a blacklist, a news blacklist, and things like Glenn Becker on it, the Daily Caller is on it, the Christian Post is on it, Life News is on it, American Thinker is on it. You can go down the long list. I won't go through all of them. And these are actually blacklisted news groups. So you can kind of see how the game is played. But anyway, she talks about one Google engineer is Greg Coppola, who was put on administrative leave after he went public in an interview with Project Veritas last month. Started in Google in 2014. Says that no one talked politics back then, but the company changed in 2016, probably in part due to the presidential election and the desire to defeat Donald Trump. He says during the interview, he explained the bias of Google algorithms. He says they don't write themselves. We write them to do what we want them to do. And when people say, well, that's just the algorithm. Yeah, well, I've written computer programs before, and I know how you can move them in different directions and look for certain kinds of words or look for certain kinds of, if you will, decision trees and those kinds of things. And so Greg Coppola explained that you get the machine learning to come out the way you want it to. Google executives weren't telling Congress the truth when they said that the Google searches aren't manipulated. His argument is they're very politically biased. He says, quote, we kind of are seeing tech use of power to manipulate people. He went on to say we have tech that really, first of all, is taking sides in a political contest. Are we going to let the big tech companies decide every election from now on? And again, Greg Coppola is concerned seeing big tech and the media merge with a political party, the Democrat Party. So those are some of the comments he makes. He also says that Google News is really an aggregator of just a handful of sites, and all those sites are against Donald Trump. Now, again, as you've heard me say so many times, or let me say it one more time because I know people listening all the time, whether it's Google or YouTube or anybody else that is out there, they are a private company. And a private company, if they want to actually bias what they produce, they're free to do so. But here's the catch. The 1996 Communications Decency Act actually make them immune of any kind of legal responsibility, because at the time, and even more recently, they keep presenting themselves, probably a better way to say it, they keep kind of saying, we're just a public forum. We're like a city park. And if somebody stands up in City Park and says something outrageous or biased or racist or homophobic or whatever, you can't sue the park because they didn't have any control over what the person said. But they're not acting so much like a public forum now. They're acting more like the Washington Post or the New York Times or some of these other groups, which are publishers or internet sites, which is fine, but then they have to be judged in that way. So the first comments come from Greg Coppola, who was really talking about the algorithms. The other individual that has come forward, his name is Zachary Voorhees, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who was employed for Google for 8 years as a software engineer. And he was the one who anonymously leaked documents from Google to Project Veritas. He leaked them because he said, quote, he saw something dark and nefarious going on with the company. He went on to say that Google was tampering with the elections to essentially overthrow the United States. And his argument is it started in 2016, and he said they wanted to create their own version of what is objectively true. Now, the point he was making is that these first round of documents, and those were leaked back in June, and we've mentioned those a little bit, but again, I know people tune in and tune out. Maybe you didn't hear all of that. Those included evidence of what were called at the time algorithmic unfairness, kind of big words for saying that the algorithm, the way in which machine language was used and machine learning was used, was sort of biased in one particular direction. So after Project Veritas published those, along with the interview with him, which they did anonymously, he received a demand letter from Google. They figured out it was him because of what he said in the interview. They said they wanted the documents back, and so Voorhees said he complied with their request, but he also sent the documents to the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division. And so law enforcement showed up at his home at the request of Google to perform a wellness check. The FBI, a SWAT team, and a bomb squad were involved. And Voorhees said this is the large way in which Google tries to intimidate their employees that go rogue on the company. You think? Well, if nothing else, he also said he was afraid for his life. He set up a dead man switch so that all the documents would be released should someone kill him, but eventually became tired of having a target on his back and decided to turn over all the remaining documents to Project Veritas. Okay, that gets us into the next point. We already talked about the algorithms. Now, if you haven't seen it, and I would like to see a complete list of these because every time I see them, I see the partial list, but this is what is called the news blacklist. And these are very significant. These are websites in the document which are prohibited from appearing in news feeds for at least Google Android products. The list includes a lot of course, conservative groups, but to be fair, also includes a couple of progressive sites as well. Some of those which we would consider somewhat mainstream would be Christian Post. I've posted stuff from Christian Post on this website before. Some from American Thinker. Well, we posted Friday the piece by Lathan Watts, and that one's on the blacklist. Daily Caller, well, that's associated with Ben Shapiro. You can imagine why that's on the list, but we've posted some of those as well. And so you've got a variety of different things that are posted. And as you might imagine, then, even as you look at the algorithm, mainstream, so-called mainstream sites like CNN, MSNBC are always ranked higher than Fox News. So you just aren't going to see a lot of those popping up necessarily right away as well. And so that is the issue as well. And so then you have a section which is called Fake News and Other Fringe. And on that, you can see, again, a ranking which is given to some. Interesting enough, Wall Street Journal is at the top of the list, but then all the ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS are those. as you might imagine, the bottom of the list is Alex Jones and maybe a few others like that. But nevertheless, you can see how they just, again, rank anything that might be balanced or even conservative much lower than the others. And when those are run through the algorithms, guess what you end up with? You end up with, of course, what you see when you do a Google search. We'll take a break. We have a lot more to cover. I'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, for a few more minutes, let me just mention again that we have posted this article, which it does give you, I think, a very good summary of two individuals that have worked for Google who have released information, one about the influence of these so-called algorithms that in many cases surface certain kinds of articles and suppress others, and then the news blacklist. And so, again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about these two individuals, Greg Coppola and Zachary Voorhees, this is an article that we have posted on the website. And again, I might also commend to you my booklet on social media if you want to write for it. It goes into the influence of social media in your life, and then has a section on social media censorship. And I think the big question is, where is this going to take us in the future? As I pointed out, you have the decision that was made back in 1996 to exempt some of these groups and to treat them as a public forum, but they're not really turning out to be that way. The more we do the research, we recognize that there is a news blacklist. And also we recognize that there is a ranking based upon those which are considered to be the most reliable. And you can, as you look at that list, see that things like Fox News or Breitbart News or some of those are much lower. And the ones at the top, I can concede Wall Street Journal's up there, but the rest are ABC, PBS, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, Associated Press, and eventually you work your way down to Fox News. So you can kind of see a little bit of bias there as well. And you might say, well, what do we do about this? Well, Congress is still looking at these issues, and I think you have to be really careful about this. One of the arguments that many people have made is, well, it's a private company. Well, that's true. And if they're going to act like a private company, then let's remove some of the protections that they have under the 1996 Communications Decency Act. But I think as an individual like you, if you're going to do various kind of searches or you're going to look for various articles or videos, I think it's really important for you to recognize that there's probably a bias there. And so be warned and check out other ways to get that information. Also, I think it's interesting that Congress and the president have been looking into this, and this article does talk about the fact that President Trump has drafted an executive order that would actually have the FTC and the FCC monitor some of the big tech giants for bias. There's been some talk about antitrust laws breaking that up. And, of course, in the book lit that I have here, I do quote from Senator Ted Cruz, who made it pretty clear that he said that actually these big tech companies are larger and more powerful than Standard Oil was when it was broken up, and larger and more powerful than AT&T when it was broken up. So maybe we break them up, maybe we don't. I don't know if that's the best procedure. I think it's something that would certainly be worthy of an open discussion, not only in Congress, but I'd love to know if indeed any of these presidential candidates on the Democratic side have any concerns about that. Dennis Prager made it very clear that he said, we recognize that we oftentimes, from a conservative point of view, aren't convinced that government is the best answer to some of the problems. But he also said, as he wrote this in the Wall Street Journal, that if the 4 major U.S. airlines announced that they would not allow passengers carrying the Wall Street Journal to travel to some American cities, would any conservatives or libertarians defend the airlines' right as private companies to do so? I think we know the answer. The answer to that would be no. So again, just wanted to put that on the table, and one of those booklets that we have is on social media. Another one that would be worthwhile is this one on Second Amendment, because my commentary today, which if you'd like to read it, is posted on the website, pointofview.net, and it's about gun violence. And I think it illustrates again that there is a real need to make sure that we get these numbers correct. We're going to have, I think, a very robust discussion and debate about various gun control measures that will surface come September when Congress comes back from recess. And one of the things I point out is that a lot of people, even that will be voting for presidential candidates and congressional candidates and even people in the state legislature and governors, oftentimes don't have an accurate understanding of some of these facts and figures. And I point out that even when you go to the Washington Post a couple of months ago, they said, quote, most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. And when I've actually shared that with individuals, they all go, is that true? I said, because you wouldn't think of that, because obviously when we see any kind of shooting, we almost get wall-to-wall coverage. And so, of course, that is the case. But as I point out, it's, again, very selective coverage because, as one commentator reminded us, in the days leading up to the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, there were 60 shootings in Chicago. In fact, there were so many shootings that one hospital on Sunday actually closed down its trauma center for any other gunshot victims because the trauma center was maxed out. And so gun violence is a problem, but it's a problem in very isolated locales. 50% of all the murders take place in just 2% of the 3,000 counties in America. So I think it's going to be important to make sure that we have good research on that. And just as I was in a Barnes & Noble the other day, I saw the cover article of, I think it was Discovery, in which they said, we need more research on guns. And I thought, yeah, I probably would be a good thing. We have people like John Lott that has collected a lot of data. We have the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that have collected quite a bit. We have the RAND Corporation that actually collected all this information and concluded that none of the gun control ideas being proposed would make any difference. So as I open up that magazine article, I'm turning page after page, and whose name do I not see? Well, I don't see John Lott's name, and yet he's probably collected more gun data than anybody else in the country. I don't think I ever saw the CDC in there, and I only saw one mention of even the RAND Corporation studies. And I thought, that's pretty pathetic. You aren't going to convince me that we need more research if the best research that's been done never gets mentioned in the magazine. Instead, it was pretty much a story of an individual in Congress that had called for more research in guns, and to its credit, did point out something that people need to remember, and that is when you see the statistics for gun violence, which I talk about in today's commentary, you've got to remind yourself that a high percentage of those gunshot wounds and gun deaths are due to suicides. Matter of fact, if you go, and don't trust my numbers for it, go look to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Each year they publish data on gun deaths. Pick any year you want, and you will see that suicides outnumber gun homicides sometimes as much as 2 to 1. So again, let's get the right figures, let's get the right numbers, let's get the right research, let's make the right decisions. But I'm not sure at a time when everybody's saying we need to do something, people are going to be thinking about this in a rational way. I'll leave that conversation for a little bit later, because when we come back from the break, we're going to have a chance to talk with Alfred Regnery. If you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that so often we seem to be quoting from and doing interviews on some of the books published by Regnery Publishing. And here is an individual that actually has kind of made a pilgrimage back to faith in some respects, and also has had a chance to kind of travel to some of these very significant places around Europe that have significance from a Christian point of view. So we're going to chat with him briefly about that. Then I'm going to get into a couple of other issues. As a matter of fact, we've posted some great material about that as well, including this ongoing war on terror that we need to pay attention to. So we've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
From Affirm Films, Provident Films, and the Kendrick Brothers comes Overcomer. John Harrison is a frustrated coach questioning his value until he crosses paths with a student struggling on her own journey.
What have you allowed to define you? When you find your identity in the one who created you, it'll change your whole perspective.
Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shirer. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters this Friday. More information is available at overcomermovie.com.
It's been said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. That was definitely true in the 19th century when preacher Charles Spurgeon said it. But here in the 21st century, truth can be just as fast. Think about it. When Point of View presents the truth, it reaches people across America and around the world instantly. You make that instant truth a reality when you join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Get all the details now at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view I think is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking about the history of Christianity and the unlikely pilgrim that had a chance to go back to some of those very important sites. If you listen to this program, you know that sometimes we talk about the sad irony of the fact that Christianity came to Europe. You read about that in Acts 16 when Paul converts Lydia, and you begin to see the incredible growth and expansion of Christianity in Europe, which really was the foundation of so much of our Christian faith. And yet today, as you look at Europe, it's really dwindling in terms of its faith. And even sometimes when we've done trips, the last trip we did was to Israel and Greece. So we got to see some of those places where the Apostle Paul was. This fall, we're going to go to Israel and Rome. And so you get the chance to walk where Jesus walked and walk where Paul walked and where he was in prison. And yet there are so many places that we have never been able to go. One of the things that is talked about in this book are the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. Now, much of those, of course, are in Turkey. It's a little harder to get to some of those places, but we're going to be talking with an individual that has had a chance to kind of go to some of those sites that were very significant in terms of our Christian faith. And his name is Alfred Regnery. And if that sounds familiar, how many times over the years have we interviewed various guests who have published with Regnery Publishing? Alfred Regnery is a publisher. He's a lawyer with a half a century of experience in business and politics, law, and journalism. Matter of fact, for a while was the counsel to the Senate committee, also a senior official in the U.S. Department of Justice. He's the president. Of course, his family's book publishing business, has written 3 books and hundreds of articles, and joins us now by phone. Alfred Regnery, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you. Very nice to be with you.
And again, thank you for all these books. I can't even think of all the different authors over the years that we've interviewed that have been in one way or another published with Regnery. So thank you for that. This book...
Well, there have been a lot of them, and they've always been a lot of fun to publish.
It certainly has. And this one's actually published by a different publishing house, but we have information about that on our website. You can get it in hardback or in Kindle. And talk about this, because you and another individual actually made some trips, or you could even call them pilgrimages, to some of those places that are kind of rich in the history of Christianity. And so the book is entitled, by the way, Unlikely Pilgrim, A Journey into Faith, History and Faith. I'll hold it up here, and of course we have information about it on our website. But talk about how this came about, because this is quite a story in itself about how you decided to make a, if you will, pilgrimage to those.
Sure. Thank you. They weren't really planned, these trips. I mean, we took the first trip we took, it's called Mount Athos in Greece, and it's a little peninsula in northeastern Greece. The only people that are there are Orthodox monks who live in monasteries, and they've been there since probably the 3rd or the 4th century AD. Mm-hmm. And the only way to get around is to walk. And a friend of mine, a German doctor actually, was going there and asked if I'd like to come along, so nice. I did. And another friend of mine who was a British theologian came along with us, and we had a fascinating 10 days staying in, I guess, 8 or 9 different monasteries and having long conversations with these monks who were there for a lifetime. Seeing the way they live, the way they pray, their devotion to faith. It was an amazing experience. And then from there, we did another trip. The second was along the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage in Spain. St. James Way, as it's sometimes known. That was a long walk. Pilgrimages, that was a pilgrim's trail that during the Middle Ages, it was estimated 1 million, pilgrims a year for 1,000 years walked along there. And so then after that, sort of one after another, and as you mentioned, we went to a lot of the holy sites in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, across Western Europe, and put it all together. I mean, just sort of one followed another, and I thought after about the fourth or the fifth that maybe this would make an interesting book. So I kept a careful diary. One of the things I always tried to do was to talk to as many people along the way as I could find and get their ideas about things and about their faith and the way faith particularly was either alive and well or had been suppressed or one time or another. And so I try to give people an idea of what it was actually like to go on these trips, and I think that's probably one of the strengths of the book. But there are 11 of these trips in all. There were 3 of them into the Balkans, to Albania, Bulgaria, 2 to Greece. Actually, we went to the Middle East, to Syria, and to Turkey, and then France, Italy, Spain, Poland. Probably forgot another one, but that's more or less the kind of places that we went. And as you mentioned, everyone was a fascinating experience.
I would think so. Let me focus on that for just a minute, because we'll get back to some of the places that Paul mentions and John mentions in the book of Revelation. But when you go to places like Romania, Albania, Poland, Bulgaria, these were countries that for a long period of time were behind the Iron Curtain. Some of them are now moving from darkness to light, but I would love to hear your comments, and you have a few of those in the book, about what it's like to go to places like Romania that were under Ceausescu, where there was so much persecution. It does seem to me that, if nothing else, there is a good reminder of the fact that even though Christianity came to those countries, all it took was for communists to take over and to try to snuff out Christianity.
Well, and they certainly did. The 2 worst were Albania and Romania. The 2 and we went to both of those. They were totally repressive places, and the communists tried to shut the church down completely. They killed priests and nuns. They razed churches. They shut down the monasteries and so on. But the interesting thing is that what they learned is you can't shut it off. Mm-hmm. Romania, a good example. Romania is largely an Orthodox Christian country, and there, the convents and the monasteries are overflowing with people. They're building new monasteries. They're building new churches. People are as devout as you can imagine. And, I mean, it's a refreshing thing that with everything they did to try to shut off Christianity, the spark remained there. And once the communism was overthrown, it was reignited, and it's just a refreshing thing. And Albania was the same way. I mean, Albania was even worse, I think, in terms of the repression. While we were there, we went to this mountaintop where there was a church, and the next week they were going to have a pilgrimage where people walked up this mountain. It was probably a 3 or 4 hour walk, and it's hot in Albania. This was in July. Mm-hmm. They expected to have 250,000 people who were going to walk up there to spend the day in prayer.
Wow.
I mean, this was a country that until 1989, if you even thought about praying, you'd go to prison for 15 years. So that's how it's changed.
Well, let's take a break. We'll spend a few more minutes talking with Alfred Regnery. The book is entitled Unlikely Pilgrim, A Journey into History and Faith. And as he points out, 11 different chapters about some of the trips to places like Spain and Greece. We'll come back and talk a little bit about Turkey, the 7 churches of Revelation. And even the last chapter talks about Paul on the Via Ignatia. I've had a chance to walk on some of that, even over there by Philippi. And so we'll talk about a little bit of that as well. But it is an interesting conversation indeed, and a sad irony that where Christianity grew so strong in Europe, how in some respects it has faded, but faith is still there among the faithful. We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In light of the publicized mass shootings, pundits and politicians are calling for action. Certainly, there are some policies that should be considered. However, these policies need to be informed by accurate numbers and statistics. Unfortunately, most Americans believe many things about gun violence that aren't true. One article that appeared in the Washington Post earlier this year warned that most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. Also, suburban and small-town women have the least accurate views about the murder rate. Some believe this demographic group will be swing voters in the 2020 election. In case you're wondering, the murder rate between 1995 and 2017 dropped by almost half. It is easy to understand why people might not know this, since every time there's a shooting, we are subjected to wall-to-wall coverage. Of course, that is not always true in some cases. In the days leading up to the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, there were 60 shootings in Chicago. There were so many, in fact, that one hospital had to stop accepting patients on Sunday because the trauma center was maxed out. Gun violence isn't uniform. Most firearm murders are concentrated in a few areas. Over half of all murders occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties, and a high percentage of those murders are linked to gang or drug activity. Also, a high percentage of gun deaths are due to suicides. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention each year publish data on gun deaths. In any particular year you pick, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes by as much as 2 to 1. There will be a major push this year to change current policies in an effort to stem gun violence. As we're debating these issues, it is crucial that pundits, politicians, and even voters have an accurate understanding of the statistics associated with gun violence. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films and the Kendrick Brothers, Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shire, rated PG, in theaters this Friday. Overcomermovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking with Alpha Regnery for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Unlikely Pilgrim, Journey into History and Faith. One of the booklets we've been making available lately is on archaeology, and certainly there have been some incredible archaeological finds both in Israel and in Greece. But you talk about the 7 churches of Revelation, and that's Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And you had suggested to your friends that maybe it would be good to actually visit those 7 churches, and that takes you to Turkey. And if nothing else, we really can get a sense of what it was like in that Greco-Roman world that the Apostle Paul found himself in as he was establishing these various churches in Asia Minor.
That's right. For nothing else, they're a long way apart. It's a long distance. And
oh, yes.
You think of Paul traveling from one place to another. Of course, he went on a boat a lot, but he walked. There was a little place called Assos, which appears in Acts, I think, twice, that Paul visited that we went to, and just always amused that Paul was there, and he and his others were going somewhere. I don't remember just where that was, and they had a boat. And Paul said, "No, it's okay, I'll walk." And so he walked probably 4 or 5 days to get there. But it's astounding to go to the places that you actually read about in the Bible, to sit there. And we always read sort of what the history of it was when we were in the places, and each of those cities. Now they're still major cities, but where the churches were. In some cases the remains of the church are there. To sit in those remains and then to read the history of it, to read what it actually says in Revelation about from each one of those. And it's not very long. Each one of them you can read it in 5 minutes. But it really brings it home, and it makes it all so much more realistic.
Well, and you even have a picture there of the library in Ephesus. So the bottom line is that sometimes when we go to these locations, they have not been covered over. I mean, you can, even in the Holy Land, you can go to a couple of places which are pretty much like they were when Jesus was there. Now, of course, Jerusalem has been built on top of each other, Rome as well in that regard. But as you go to some places in Turkey, some places in Greece, you can get a pretty good idea of what it must have been like for, in the case of the churches in Revelation, for John to have written about that, for Paul to have established those churches,
right.
what it really looks like. And that's pretty amazing to me.
You can. One reason for that is that Turkey is hot and dry, and so as opposed to Northern Europe or other places where it's wet and cold and so on, the stonework is still in pretty good shape in many cases. Syria as well. We did go to Syria, and there's some astounding places in Syria that you can just walk in. There's no fences, there's no guard, anything else. You walk around, and of course the ISIS destroyed a good many of them when they were there. Unfortunately they had access to them too, but nevertheless, there they are, and it's like an open-air museum.
And matter of fact, we're going to talk about ISIS in just a minute after you go, because there was an ISIS attack in Afghanistan. We'll get to that. But since you mentioned Syria, before we get to the other part of Greece, that was amazing to me as well. Yes, ISIS has destroyed a number of things, although, as I even point out in the archaeology piece here, ISIS accidentally actually confirms the Bible in one place when they were in the ancient city of Nineveh, now known as Mosul. But nevertheless, there are still places, if you can make it to Syria, as dangerous it is now, that also give you a little bit of the history of Christianity in that region of the world.
Oh, very much so. I mean, Syria is rich in Christian things. I was there in 2001, so it was before the unpleasantness. But I went to one church that was, they said it was the oldest established Christian church in the world.
Yes.
The people in the village still spoke Aramaic. The church was 2nd century. It had been a pagan temple before, been turned into a Christian church, I guess, in the 2nd or 3rd century. I don't remember which one. And it had been open ever since. ISIS came in and destroyed it in 20 minutes, killed everybody, blew it up. There was another place where there was actually a painting that was allegedly painted by Luke. Again, a place where they spoke Aramaic. It's not too far from Damascus, and that was blown up as well. I mean, it's awful when you think about it, but I feel very privileged to have been in those places, and again, I try to describe them as well as I can in the book.
That's just excellent. Book over 200 pages. Just before I let you go, I wanted to talk about Chapter 11, following St. Paul on the Via Ignatia. And when you talk about walking, one of the reasons this works is because the Romans had built this incredible complex which connected so much of Asia Minor to Rome itself. And I've been to Philippi and seen the walk that he took there. I've been to Thessaloniki, Macedonia. Of course, you have a picture or a diagram of Pella. This is pretty amazing because, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, you can go to those places. Many of them are still intact, like Philippi, for example, or Corinth. And you can get a sense of what it must have been like to have traveled down the road and to have really come to the conclusion that indeed that is how the gospel was spread, starting in Acts 16 all the way down to Acts 17 to Athens and on through the rest of the Roman Empire. So that time that you took to walk down the Via Ignatia, pretty significant, and that's how you end the book.
We did. That's why actually we rode bicycles on that one. That was you could do it a bicycle probably 3 or 4 times faster than walking, and it was a very difficult bicycle ride. But yeah, it's an amazing thing. This Roman road was built 200 years before Christ. It's still intact. I mean, not everywhere, but there are places where you can actually drive a car down it or ride a bicycle down it. It's all stone, and they built it so they could use it for transport, for commerce, for armies, and then of course Paul used it, and people have been using it ever since. So it was the beginning of the system of linking places together we know so well now, and the Christians used it to their great advantage.
I just thought, before I let you go, let's talk about how people can use this book. Some of the things you describe are no longer available because of some of the destruction we've talked about. Some of the others are very difficult to get because they're war zones. And others, quite frankly, unless you have the financial resources, you'll never get to. So in some respects, this book is kind of like a travelogue. And even though maybe you won't be able to go to some of these very significant sites, by reading the book and seeing some of the diagrams, you'll have a sense of what it was really like.
Well, I hope so. And we traveled in a way that, we tried, as I say, walking, bicycling. We stayed in dormitories and cheap hotels. So we tried to, the extent we could, sort of recreate the way people traveled. But again, just to be in those places and to sit there, I describe sitting on a wall, looking at the place where the Nicene Creed was worked out and written.
Yes.
And I can't recite the Nicene Creed now without that image going through my head. And it just means so much more to you. I mean, we read these things, we recite them and so on, but where you've actually been there and experienced it, it is the difference between being able to see and being blind. It's an amazing thing, and I hope I recreate that in the book. So, as you say, people can at least get a sense of the way it was, and again make the both the history and the faith that they know more realistic.
Again, Unlikely Pilgrim, A Journey into History and Faith, published by Buford Books. And again, you probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so you can get it both in hardback and in Kindle, and about 220 some odd pages. And so, Alfred Regnery, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much for the interview. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Well, and thank you for all those great Regnery books. We'll probably be interviewing. Matter of fact, just last Thursday, we interviewed an author that had been one of the authors of Regnery books. So let's take a break. When we come back, we were talking about ISIS, and that is my first article here. I want to get into that, the ISIS attack in Afghanistan, and talk about that briefly. And then we'll also get into a couple of other topics that I have been sparing you from so far. So if you'd like to join us in this last half hour, 1-800-351-1212. Just thought this would be an interesting book. I know very, very few of you will ever be able to go with us on our trips that we've taken to Israel and to Greece. This time we're going Israel and Rome. And you say, but I'd like to know what it is like. And so in some respects, this is a book I might commend to you that will take you through some of these very important sites, and also recognize that because he was able to get into places like Syria, nobody's traveling to Syria anymore. And frankly, it's pretty tough to even go to many of the sites in Turkey that exist, and some of the other places in Romania. Even following the Via Ignatia, you got to get off the bus, walk a little bit, and then walk right back. And he actually was able to bicycle down and tell you what it was like to be in Philippi and many of those other places. So I just think it would give you a little bit of a sense of the eyes and ears that we look for so often as we tell you the story about Christian faith. So we're going to take a break, and we'll come back, and I want to talk a little bit about the latest and the most devastating ISIS attack. And just a reminder once again that even though there are some that want to just ignore this war on terror, we do need to pay attention to what has been happening even in the capital of Afghanistan. So that's our first article. It'll get into a couple of other very important issues that we will talk about. And all that comes up right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles I've posted here for your consideration has to do with this horrific attack that took place in Afghanistan. You know, we have been fortunate that we've had very few terrorist attacks other than some of the domestic terrorism that we've talked about. But certainly when we talk about ISIS, which has been significantly degraded, and that is due in large part to some of the military action. But the reason ISIS or the Islamic State grew, many commentators believe, is due to the decision of the previous president to pull troops out. And what will happen if indeed we pull troops not only out of Iraq, but Afghanistan? And this is the tragedy of the weekend, in which you had a suicide bomber standing in the middle of this wedding in Kabul, Afghanistan, which is the capital. You had hundreds of Afghan children and adults celebrating a wedding, and all of a sudden, explosive suicide vest killed 63, according to this article. I think the death count's gone up since then, but I'll just use the numbers in the article we've posted. It's the first article we posted on pointofview.net. And the deadliest attack in the capital this year, 63 killed, 182 wounded, while outraged Afghans, it says, question just how safe they were under an approaching deal between the United States and the Taliban to end America's longest war. I recognize that we have at least two different views represented even in our listening audience. And one is to say, look, if we are not maintaining some kind of presence in the Middle East, these kind of horrific acts will take place again and again. And we can't control all of those, but certainly we can protect some of the people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. But more importantly, we can protect ourselves, because if we allow a terrorist group to get another foothold, they could launch another 9/11 attack against us. So that's kind of the military action option. Of course, you also have the others, which are represented now by the previous president, Barack Obama, and the current president, Donald Trump, and probably represented by most of the Democratic candidates. We'll see what they say about some of this, if this conversation even comes up. Notice how little we've talked about the war on terror in the last couple of years. It was a major topic with George W. Bush. It was still somewhat of a topic with Barack Obama, and it's become much less of a topic under Donald Trump, and it really almost didn't even surface in the last two Democrat debates. Maybe it will surface in this one because of this action. But as I read this article, it reminds us of how these families buried their dead. Some have been digging with their bare hands. One wounded individual wore his bloodied clothes the day after the blast that took place. He and his friends already had buried 16 bodies. And it's just a horrific kind of action that took place. And as it goes on to say, the emergence of the Islamic State affiliate in recent years might be the greatest threat to the Afghan civilians, as right now, back to the key point, the United States and the Taliban are seeking an agreement to end the fighting after 18 years. Now, let's recognize that when we enter into an agreement with the Taliban, first of all, we don't necessarily expect them to hold to that agreement. Second of all, we acknowledge that the Taliban is really one of the more virulent terrorist groups itself. Taliban is from the word for students, and these were individuals that were studying as students a very radical form of Islam in Pakistan. And once the vacuum was created as Russia left Afghanistan, they took over. And they prevented women from being educated. You could actually be punished, maybe even killed for such what seemed like small violations of the Taliban law, like flying a kite, playing rock music, whatever there might be. And, of course, even if the United States can get some kind of assurance that the Taliban will prevent various groups from gaining a foothold and being able to use this as a launching pad for global terrorist attacks, there's no guarantee that they would abide by that, or even if they were to try to do so, that they would have enough military might to do that. And so even though the Taliban is trying to maybe control the rise of ISIS or the Islamic State, you can recognize that we've got some very significant challenges before us, and it's something that we shouldn't take our eyes off of in this particular case. But back to this sad, sad tragedy. If you want to read more about this, the wedding had more than 1,200 people who had been invited. It was a huge event. It was a mixed crowd of Shiites and Sunnis, and it was in the hall of Hussein Ali. As a matter of fact, interesting enough, a lot of the Shiites use the name Hussein because he was very significant in their history. And this is something where they're still picking up literally pieces not only of glass, but pieces of people all over the place. And just a horrific kind of action that took place just this weekend. But you can go back just a few days to August 7th when a Taliban car bomber aimed at Afghan security forces detonated his explosives on a road outside of Kabul. And that killed 14 people and wounded 145, most of them women, children, and other civilians. So this is an ongoing issue, and it is something that we should still pay attention to, and it's something that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about because, quite frankly, when we look at the issues in the news right now, most of the focus has been on these Democratic candidates who are proposing such things as Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, guaranteed wages, and a variety of other topics, but it's still something that deserves our attention, and so we'll continue to talk about it here on Point of View. Just before we take a break, though, let me mention something else. On Friday, as we came to the end of the program, I asked Lathan Watts to remind us of the fact that their court case on the Bladensburg Cross was having a positive impact. And to their credit, the editors of the Wall Street Journal actually wrote about that today. They refer to it as the secular busybodies lose again. And sometimes people say, okay, you won a Supreme Court case. This was the Peace Cross in Bladensburg, Maryland. So what? Well, so what is that now a federal appeals court has applied the logic of that case to save a 75-year-old county seal. It's Lehigh County in Pennsylvania, which includes, by the way, Allentown. It has a seal, which has a number of things. It has factories. It has some people working. It has some flags. It has a heart. It has what looks like the city center there, and it has a cross. So it has a number of things. It has a bison head, a grain silo, a variety of things, smokestacks. And so, of course, as you might imagine, our friends there at the Freedom from Religion Foundation filed a lawsuit back in 2014 wanting the Lehigh County to remove the religious symbols, which actually is just one, the cross, as far as I can tell, from that. And so they, first of all, raised the question. Then the suit actually went forward in 2016. And interestingly enough, what you had is a federal court that reluctantly ruled the seal to be a violation of the First Amendment. And so that pumped it back up to the appeals court. And the Third Circuit Court of Appeals actually said, nope, it's just fine the way it is. And what they did was simply quote from the Supreme Court's decision saying that the Lemon Test is dead regarding monuments, symbols, mottos, displays, and ceremonies. Now, again, every time I mention that, people say, okay, can you explain the Lemon Test? Okay, one more time. In 1971, there was a very important court case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. And at that time, the justices actually imposed upon the Constitution 3 tests, so-called Lemon tests, that it was supposed to, whatever that might have a religious function, might have at least a secular purpose, that it would not involve excessive entanglement. And my argument would be that even if you use the Lemon test, what's the secular purpose? Well, it's to have a seal for Lehigh County. Any entanglement? No, not really. So I think you could probably have, even using the Lemon test, said that the seal for Lehigh County is not an unconstitutional establishment of religion. But the good news is that nevertheless, you have the court, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, saying that the Lemon test is dead. And I thought it was kind of interesting because the person who wrote this particular opinion, Judge Thomas Hardiman, If that name sounds familiar, he's on President Trump's short list for the Supreme Court. Matter of fact, it's quite possible he might have been on the court instead of Brett Kavanaugh. So maybe we're going to hear from him again. But here's a good example. Supreme Court ruling, set aside this frivolous case. Good news. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just finish off there because I was coming to one of those mandatory breaks and thought I just might mention, again, one of the other booklets we have here is on constitutional interpretation. And when sometimes people say, well, what's this lemon test and how was that used to declare certain things like school prayer and the Ten Commandments and even nativity scenes were unconstitutional? Some of those happened before the 1971 Lemon versus Kurtzman decision, but this Supreme Court decision that came down as a result of our good friends at First Liberty has really said that the Lemon test is dead regarding monuments, symbols, mottos, displays, and ceremonies. And interestingly enough, the opinion was written by Judge Thomas Hardiman. Now, you might remember when we were speculating as to who Donald Trump might put on as the Justice of the Supreme Court. Of course, we talked about Neil Gorsuch, who is on the court. We talked about Brett Kavanaugh, who's on the court. But one of the other people we talked about is Thomas Hardiman. Now, he's still there on the Third Circuit Court. He's on the short list by Donald Trump as a potential Supreme Court pick. I suspect that if indeed Ruth Bader Ginsburg ever steps down, He would actually pick a woman. But nevertheless, I think Thomas Hardiman is somebody to pay attention to because he's on the short list. And Thomas Hardiman, in this case involving what was actually happening there at Lehigh, Pennsylvania, said, quote, "The Latin cross at issue here is no doubt carrying religious significance," but he said, "but more than 7 decades after its adoption, the seal has become a familiar, embedded feature of Lehigh County, attaining a broader meaning than any one of its many symbols. The seal will stand." So if nothing else, sometimes people will ask me, well, it's great that they won the Supreme Court case. What does that mean? Well, it means that those ideas have filtered down, and now in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, the next time somebody like the ACLU or the Americans United for Separation of Church and State or the Freedom from Religion Foundation questions, whatever it could be, a nativity scene, a monument, a seal, they're going to say, we've already ruled on that. We don't even need to consider your case. We'll just simply remove it from the docket. We won't even listen to it because we already know how we're supposed to rule on that. So if nothing else, kudos to the Wall Street Journal for talking about how the secular busybodies have lost again. And if you don't think that elections have consequences, you haven't been paying attention, because look at the rulings that came down from those 2 justices and the rulings that have come down from another person that might even be on the Supreme Court who's on President Donald Trump's short list. Just before we take a break, let me also talk about my commentary tomorrow. Nick Pitts will be sitting here, so I won't have a chance to talk about it, but it's called The Hottest Month, and it relates back to, and here's another one of the booklets we have on climate change. On Wednesday, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Bruce Bunker. He's had over 100 different peer-reviewed articles in things like Scientific American and Science and others, and he has written this book called The Mythology of Global Warming. Well, the reason I wrote this piece on the hottest month is whenever you hear about it being the hottest month, it seems to reinforce this idea that we're in the midst of some kind of meteorological catastrophe. And so there are all sorts of stories that are out there recording that last month, July of 2019, was hotter than July 2016, so it makes the hottest month on record. Was it? Well, one of the reasons I wrote the commentary is to quote from climatologist Dr. Roy Spencer, who's also been on the program with us, who argues that the July 2019 was not the warmest on record. He does acknowledge that it is the hottest based on global average surface air temperatures, but he explains for a number of reasons why those numbers may be inaccurate. And, of course, we can tell why they are. In the commentary, I talk about 2. The first is what you call the urban heat island effect. If you happen to live near a very significant city, and I know some of you do and some of you do not, but if you do, as you even watch the nightly news when they talk about weather, you'll notice that the heat inside that city is a lot warmer than what you might have in the suburbs or out there in the rural area, and that's because we have the place where you oftentimes have a lot of land thermometer sites that are affected by the heat from buildings, parking lots, air conditioning units, vehicles, things of that nature. And so sometimes that affects the overall temperature measurement there when it's averaged with all the rest, make things look hotter. Then the other one that I talk about is ocean temperatures. I won't go into all the details there, but again, there's some really significant questions about that. So you might say, okay, Dr. Roy Spencer, since you have some questions about that, what would you suggest? And he talks about NOAA's climate forecast system, in which they do what's called a reanalysis data. And you can look at that map. We're going to post that tomorrow on the Point of View website, and you can look at it. And what you'll notice, interestingly enough, is that the weather experience last month, as documented on that chart, probably matches your experience. For example, those of you in the Midwest all the way down to Texas will notice that you had cooler than normal temperatures in July. I'm broadcasting today from Texas. Lots of times there's a lot of 100-degree days in July. There just weren't. You'll also notice that some other places are hotter than normal. One of those is Siberia. Another one was Antarctica. So those are the ones you hear about. Matter of fact, if you look at the latest issue of Time magazine, it talks about it was the hottest month in the history of the earth. First of all, it was not. But more to the point, it illustrates again that you would probably, if you wanted to get a more accurate reading, look at the reanalyst data. But you might say, well, okay, why don't they? Well, because those only go back, a few decades, and most meteorologists and climatologists want longer positions. But even Dr. Roy Spencer says if you go back and look at that data from a little more objective standard, you would say that July 2019 was probably the fourth hottest month in the last 4 decades. But that's not what you read in the headlines, and that's certainly not what is in the latest issue of Time magazine. So if nothing else, I just wanted to give you a different perspective. Recognize that the climate always is changing. In my little booklet on climate change, I acknowledge that the climate has changed quite a bit. We've had a Roman warming period. We've had a little ice age. We had a medieval warming period. There are some, as I documented the other day, that say we may be headed for a cooling phase again based upon the orbit of the Earth and the solar principles that are there in terms of the lack of solar flares and things of that nature. So we recognize climate has been changing, but before we're ready to adopt the Green New Deal, maybe we want to get some accurate numbers on that as well. So that's one of the reasons why I did a commentary, which you can read tomorrow, on whether or not July 2019 was the hottest month ever. Well, that's all we have for today. Let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find my article today on gun violence, the one tomorrow on hottest month. We also have many of these articles on a variety of different issues that I hope will be of help to you today. And so take the time to read those. And if you'd like to listen to them again, of course, you can download the podcast. If you'd like to watch it again, of course, you can hit that button that says watch or simply go to the YouTube channel. And if you haven't obtained the Point of View app, I have that on my phone. I use that sometimes when I want to go back and check a fact or a figure or a quote. And I would encourage you to use it as well. All available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Look forward to the Millennial Roundtable tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you.